What do you know about New York's skyscrapers? How did the famous skyline develop? And who was responsible for building them? Let's find out in today's episode of the History Chronicles. Today's History Chronicle begins on the 1st of May, 1931. On this day, a new building was formally opened for business in New York City, with the ceremony to celebrate the event presided over by the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. The building stood 1,250 feet tall on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan between 33rd and 34th Street. It was now the world's tallest building, and would remain so until 1970. It was, of course, the Empire State Building, New York's most famous skyscraper, which amazingly was built in just 18 months, and which capped off an intense period of skyscraper construction on Manhattan Island in the center of New York City. Here we look at how Manhattan came to have so many enormous skyscrapers in the early 20th century. To understand Manhattan's skyline, you have to consider the specifics of how New York developed. This is a city which was first established as a small settlement on the island of Manhattan. In 1800, it still had a population of little more than 60,000 people, but in the century and a half that followed, this ballooned so that by 1850 it was closer to 600,000. The first years of the 20th century saw the number of New Yorkers grow to 4 million, and it nearly doubled again by the early 1920s. This huge demographic expansion was largely driven by vast influxes of Irish, Italian, and other ethnic migrants from Europe fleeing from famines and economic downturns in their respective home countries. As New York expanded dramatically, it spread outwards to Brooklyn, the Bronx, and other areas, but even this could not accommodate everyone who needed to live in proximity to the city in the days before private automobiles and the work commute. Accordingly, real estate prices in Manhattan began to rise in line with the population expansion. And as they did, and new building methods became available in the late 19th century, New York's real estate barons began conceiving of a different way of building. Instead of expanding the city outwards, they could build upwards towards the sky. Hence the concept of the skyscraper was born, a word which was first used in 1883. While early modern building methods had allowed for the construction of buildings with large domes and buildings of a half a dozen or so floors, a number of innovations in the mid-19th century made it feasible to begin building much higher. These included the use of safety elevators and other building apparatus, but the major shift was in the introduction of steel frames to erect buildings around. With these, it became possible to construct buildings much higher without them collapsing. An early example was the Equitable Life building on Broadway in Manhattan, which was 9 stories high and was opened in 1870, but the skyscraper craze really got going in 1885, when the Home Insurance Building was opened in Chicago. At nearly 200 feet tall, New York's real estate magnates quickly saw the financial possibilities if they began constructing skyscrapers in Manhattan, where office and residential space was at a premium. One example of this early boom in skyscrapers is instructive of how they developed over time. In 1896, work was completed on the American Surety Building at 96 to 100 on Broadway in Manhattan. It stood 21 stories high and was erected using a steel structure. It also incorporated new wind bracing technology, which allowed the large bay windows and the structure in general to withstand gusts up to 82 miles per hour, and it had more than 400 rooms on completion, served by 6 elevators. Such a building would have been inconceivable 50 years earlier. Things escalated rapidly after this. In 1899, New York took the prize for the world's tallest building away from the City Hall building in Milwaukee, when the Park Row building opened at 15 Park Row in the financial district of Manhattan. Rising to 26 stories, it contained enough workspaces for over 4,000 people when it was completed after nearly 3 years of construction. It would remain the tallest building in the world for nearly 10 years until the crown was seized by a near neighbour in 1908. The Park Row building stood at 390 feet and had constituted a 12% increase on the height of the Milwaukee City Hall building when it replaced it as the world's tallest building in 1899. But the size of skyscrapers being built in Manhattan ballooned in the 1900s and the 1910s. In 1908, the Singer Building, or Singer Tower, opened on the corner of Liberty Street and Broadway. Reaching to a height of 612 feet, it constituted a 57% increase on the height of the Park Row building. Yet it was overtaken just weeks later with the completion of the Metropolitan Life Tower in the Flatiron District. which soared to 700 foot. Beyond their sheer height and structural impressiveness, many of these skyscrapers became hallmarks of New York's architecture in other ways, with some incorporated aspects of the Beaux Arts architectural movement. But New York's skyscrapers are most notable for their use of Art Deco in their makeup, an architectural style which originated in France after the years before the outbreak of the First World War. Combining modern styles with sophisticated craftsmanship and high-quality building material, its use in New York's skyscrapers was intended to convey the confidence and wealth of Manhattan's business elite who commissioned these towers. Art Deco features are incorporated into the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, amongst others. Even the Metropolitan Life Tower was eclipsed just 4 years later, when the Woolworth Building on Broadway in Manhattan was completed in 1913. Standing 790 foot tall and consisting of 55 stories, it was the architectural feat of its time. Built by F.W. Woolworth as the headquarters of the chain of 5 and 10 cent discount stores, it also had many other features, the most peculiar perhaps being a private swimming pool in the basement and an observatory on the top of the building. The Woolworth Building would stand as the tallest building in not just New York, but the entire world until 1930. But the 1920s saw the final major episode in New York's skyscraper race. The decade witnessed an enormous economic boom in the developed world, as Western states left the quagmire of the First World War and consumer demand for new products which were emerging onto the market skyrocketed. As a result, the decade has come to be known as the Roaring Twenties. Yet, there was also an acquisitive, vain, and glorious edge to the economic success of the Roaring Twenties. As many people invested money they simply didn't have, and America's great business magnates undertook vanity projects to propagandize their wealth and business power to the world. New York's skyline would become a feature of this, as several of the city's major business and real estate magnates began competing in the second half of the 1920s to supersede the Woolworth Building and gain pride of place as both New York City's and the world's tallest skyscraper. Many of these individuals are well known. For instance, John D Rockefeller Jr., who developed 30 Rockefeller Plaza, which opened in 1933, was the son of the infamous American oil tycoon and businessman, also named John D Rockefeller. The family's immense fortune was generated in the 19th century through the Standard Oil Company, which he founded, while in the years that followed, he used his capital to gain a major stake in the development of the US's extensive railroad system. Rockefeller Jr.'s entry into the skyscraper race was a demonstration of his development of the family's interest in New York City's real estate market. Another major figure from amongst those who entered into the skyscraper race was Walter Chrysler, the driving force behind the development of the Chrysler Building. He was the head of the Chrysler Corporation, at the time a relatively new but an aggressive and increasingly popular automobile manufacturer in the United States. Yet, often, it was not individuals who were working to produce New York's highest skyscraper. For instance, the Manhattan Company, one of New York's largest banking firms, was seeking to build a new headquarters in the late 1920s and wished for the building they would construct to be New York's tallest. These were the main players in the final acts of the skyscraper race. The Manhattan Company struck first when their headquarters, 40 Wall Street, was opened in 1930. Standing 928 foot high, it finally eclipsed the Woolworth Building as New York and the world's largest skyscraper. Yet just weeks later, the banking firm's desire to have Manhattan's tallest building was scuppered when Walter Chrysler's own project was fully realized. The Chrysler Building was over 100 foot taller than 40 Wall Street and was the first building in the world to soar over a kilometer into the sky. But eventually it was another individual altogether who would pip the Rockefellers, Chrysler, and the Manhattan Company in the race to build New York's tallest skyscraper. John Jacob Raskop, a highly successful American businessman who had worked for DuPont and General Motors, as well as being involved in US politics. It was he who conceived of the Empire State Building and drove its construction, which, as we saw at the beginning, was finally realized on the 1st of May 1931 when the building was opened. The opening of the Empire State Building brought the race to build New York's tallest building to an end. This was owing to the economic circumstances of the time. Following the Wall Street crash in 1929 and the Great Depression that followed, the cost-benefit of erecting such buildings temporarily plummeted. Indeed, the Empire State Building is notorious for having been largely empty for much of the 1930s. Such was the lack of demand for expensive Manhattan office space at the time. Eventually, Raskop's skyscraper was eclipsed with the construction of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. These dual towers were 1,362 feet tall and now took the Empire State Building's crown as the tallest buildings in New York. Today, they are known for the terrorist attack on them on the 11th of September 2001. Yet it is a symbol of the resilience of New York's landscape of skyscrapers that their replacement, opened in 2014, One World Trade Center, stands at nearly 1,800 feet, towering above all its cousins on Manhattan Island. In total, there are 290 buildings designated as skyscrapers in New York today, making it the city with the third highest number of skyscrapers of any city on Earth. In this regard, it is eclipsed only by Hong Kong, with a staggering 482 skyscrapers, a result of the island city's similar lack of real estate to Manhattan, and Shenzhen in China, with 297 skyscrapers, just 7 more than New York. After these, there is a dramatic fall before we find the city with the 4th largest amount of skyscrapers, that being Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, with 215 buildings designated as skyscrapers. Thus, even today, years after its skyscraper craze of the early 20th century, New York City, and in particular Manhattan Island, is amongst the most significant urban spaces for skyscraper development in the entire world. Yet we end where we begin. Today, a new skyscraper race is emerging on Manhattan Island. While it seems inappropriate to try to top One World Trade Center, given the circumstances of how the building emerged, others are vying for second spot. In 2015, 432 Park Avenue was opened, standing nearly 1,400 feet tall, while this was eclipsed by a few feet when One Vanderbilt opened in 2020. Yet, that was eclipsed by a development which opened the very same year. At 1,550 feet, Central Park Tower, also known as the Nordstrom Tower, is New York's second biggest building after One World Trade Center, and it also has the distinction of being the tallest residential building anywhere in the world. As such, even 140 years after the city's skyscrapers started emerging, New York is still being built further and further upwards. You have been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to know what you think of New York's skyscrapers. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page. We look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the History Chronicles.